right. So
You got the little ponytail thing going on today.
they're called space buns.
Oh, is that what they're called?
They are. My 16-year-old daughter did them for me.
Oh, very nice.
So yeah, thank you. So
Welcome to Talking in the Chasm.
Welcome to Talking in the Chasm. Compassionate, controversial conversation between best friends. Holy man.
And the atheist.
The atheist.
I'm Matthew.
And I'm Felix. Today
we're gonna get into, I guess we would call it mythology.
Yeah.
Is that the right way to say it?
Maybe, yeah. As I was writing down various topics, I wrote down storytelling. When does storytelling become law?
Okay.
And this is maybe a controversial way of saying it, because storytelling implies fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't believe that the Bible is fiction. So, I'm just, assuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that you believe it's the truth.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to misquote Penn Jillette, who's an outspoken atheist.
An all-around nice guy.
Hilarious. Really funny guy. Good magician. Anyway. He said something to the effect of, if humanity were to be wiped out and to start again, we would come up with stories about the existence and how the earth moves and the stars and where plants come from and why the grass is green. We would come up with all these different stories around the world, and they would be different stories. They wouldn't match the stories that we tell ourselves now, which we then, group into what we call religion, right? It's these stories of creation and everything. However, science would eventually get back to exactly where we are now. And his, idea is that science is truth. Mm-hmm. And that it is, it will get to where it is now because this is the way that it works, and it works every single time. Whereas, were humanity to be extinguished, would the people come up with Jesus Christ and the Son of God and crucifixion or the Buddha and the tree and the mythologies of Egyptian and the beetle rolling the sun across the sky and stuff like that.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I think it gets at a bigger idea of what's being communicated in story. And there's a couple ways to look at that. Like, for one, it's amazing the continuity between human story. For instance, there are dozens of cultures that have a global flood narrative that are disconnected cultures. There are remarkable similarities in structure around creation narrative. So one wonders if the stories that men have made come from men, like from the psychological, sociological components of mankind, if we wouldn't come up with the same stories, if we wouldn't, so maybe if the world ends, it's not Israel, it's Jabubel. I don't know what it's called, right. but it serves a similar mythological narrative. It serves a function in the same way. The places are changed and the names are changed, but the stories are the same. Right. I think there's a good case to be made for that.
That's very interesting. Yes, and Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth. Did you read this? It was basically, it basically says, well, there's only a few stories that ever get told.
Yeah,
people fall in love and they break up, or it doesn't work, or whatever. There's a murder. There's only a few
hate,
stories,
love,
right, that we can
brotherhood,
tell.
Nation.
Yeah, and I imagine that a river overflows and a bunch of squirrels and little creatures die, and then a man sees that and goes, "Wow." What would that imagine if that happened to us? Imagine if it happened to, the mountains turned into water, and all of a sudden, what would that be like? I can imagine every culture could see creatures dying in a flood and think, oh wow, what would that be? So that would be
Well,
global
and maybe
flood. Could
so.
be
I actually believe there was a global flood, but along that, why are these flood narratives so ubiquitous? Like, you can imagine if your world is as big as the land that you can see, and the land that you can see floods, that's a global flood.
Right.
Like, what else do you know except for what's there?
But that's just that's just a reason of how such a thing could become a global phenomenon. Why in India they would have a flood narrative in the same way that they would have one in Native America, and because floods happen.
I think what's more interesting to me, I don't take Penn's statement. I've heard it, and I don't. It's not that meaningful of a distinction to me. Like the idea that, because I think that the stories that we tell function in just as real a way as the scientific narrative. So let me start over. Jordan Peterson's one academic work is Maps of Meaning, and what his theory is that there are basically two kinds of ways that there are two things that we talk about. We talk about what is and what means. Like, so what something is, like I can measure the width of this table, I can take apart the species of the wood, we can put it under a microscope, we can see the cells, we can take those cells apart and we can see the atoms, like what is it?
Right.
But that's actually not as important. It is important for a lot of things, but it's not as important as what a table means. And what a table means is family and connection and food. And so the meaning of things is at least half of the story.
Okay.
And so the meaning around things is another way that we communicate. Well, how do you define our relationship when we eat food? Like, that's not an is, that's a means.
Right. I mean, you could say that science looks at the how and religion looks at the why.
Or the what and the why.
Yeah.
Sure.
But my point, the problem that I have with religion is that each religion claims to be the religion. Mm-hmm. And there's many, many, many of them. Mm-hmm. And were the world to be wiped out, then there would be many, many more who would claim to be the religion, and they would all be very different than the ones that we have now, which just leads me to believe that it is a fiction, that we needed religion to explain things that now science is explaining, and eventually science will fill in all the gaps and possibly explain everything, or maybe it won't.
I don't think it will.
I've said this before, but I like that science encourages doubt, and one of the things that science has doubt about is God. I mean, science doesn't say God doesn't exist. Science says there's no evidence that God exists.
Is the evidence in meaning, or is the evidence in things? Like, if the evidence is in meaning, there's lots of evidence for God. If this evidence is in things, if it's if it can only be evidence if it's quantifiable, then okay, there's no evidence for God. But if I see meaning in the world, in my relationships, if my life changes because of a connection to the divine, if I have, experiences that are life-changing and life-altering in the Eucharist with my church, like, those are evidences. They're just they're not quantifiable evidence.
Well, I mean, we've said this in a previous episode, but you and I are both looking at a beautiful painting that we both happen to love. Mm-hmm. We both feel something, mm-hmm. We both, and it doesn't have to be painted. It could be something natural, right? A sunset, a tree, whatever. a cool snake, or whatever. It could be something awesome like that. And then you feel that is God mm-hmm. talking to you, really. I mean, mm-hmm. This is God made this, and it's mm-hmm. beautiful because there's a God. This shows that there's a God because there is beauty, and this thing that I feel isn't something quantifiable. I feel beauty as well. But I'm a little bit actually fascinated by, is it quantifiable? Mm-hmm. We talk about the golden ratio and stuff like that. It's interesting to me because they say, oh, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but what if it isn't? Mm-hmm. I learned that Marilyn Monroe, right? She was buxom. She would be considered a plus size model today, probably, mm-hmm. right? And Kate Moss from the early 90s. She was like super
Vaguely, yeah.
skinny, rail skinny, called heroin chic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have the same waist to hip ratio. You know, and so stuff like that makes you go, is that, do men find that waist to hip ratio attractive and always have and always will? And there's something scientific about it. It has to do with, you know, good, you say in your mind, oh, you know, good breeding, or I don't know, you know, but maybe there is something scientific about it. Maybe there's a reason that we think this flower is really beautiful and that this one is really ugly, even though it's not universal, but some things are darn near universal. You know, most people can agree that the Statue of David is pretty cool. You know, the stance, it stands the way most humans, the contrapposto, or the way we're leaning. The sculpture is very realistic as far as anatomy. I mean, it's pretty cool. You know, I can't imagine being revolted by it unless you don't like nudity or something. But that's you know. So.
But what about Jackson Pollock?
So Jackson Pollock, that is interesting because I actually saw a really cool Jackson Pollock exhibit at the Pompidou Center in France, and they filmed him. They did a plexiglass thing, and there was a camera underneath, and he was painting on the plexiglass because he does this dance.
Yeah,
you know, he throws it on the ground. It's not, you know, on the wall. He throws it on the ground and makes his painting. And then, you know, and they talk to him about it and stuff. And he throws away about 70% of the paintings he makes because they're not right? But he makes one that's right. And one thing that science has done is they've taken the ratios of the different colors in a Jackson Pollock and have learned that there is a specific ratio that's true to all of his paintings. And that it's, so
you can test a real Pollock by the ratio.
And that is how they test to see whether a Pollock is a fake or not. This one's random. This one is not random. It looks random. It may, but there's something that feels right about it, right?
But isn't
it's
that
sort of like
is that the artist communicating? Like, we like that because it's Pollock, right?
Well, it's sort of the rule of thirds kind of thing. For some reason, humans just find it more pleasing when things are located, you know, 2/3 of the way up or down in a picture. Why do people do that? Maybe the eyes are 2/3 of the way up your face. I mean, you know, there's probably scientific reasons why we like what we like, and I'm fascinated by that just because it seems so opposite of it. Because you feel, I feel it, and it feels right to me. But maybe it feels right to you because there are scientific principles at play that you don't understand, and in that way, you know, you say, well, maybe it feels right to you because God created this thing and you don't understand that. You know,
that's just a description of the design.
Yes, and the things can be beautiful for beauty's sake. That beauty in itself is not evidence of God to me. I mean, you know, something can be beautiful and it not be divinely created. I mean, you could throw some sand on the ground and it may land in a way that's just cool. You know, it makes me want to take a photograph of it. And you may throw sand on the ground and it's just a pile of sand. I mean, you know, there are things that make it what it is.
But I don't think that I could ever be convinced that everything is reducible to that level. That there's nothing that's what's that expression? Je ne sais quoi. There's nothing in it. There's no essence of the thing.
Right.
There's no
soul.
Yeah. There's nothing. That it's all just pattern recognition. It's all just firing chemicals. Like,
so you don't think we could ever teach a robot to paint or to compose music?
No, I think we could. I think that there is certainly, like, but I don't know that you could ever recreate Jackson Pollock. Not Jackson Pollock's paintings,
no, I understand.
But Jackson Pollock, like the movement that created his art.
Well, yeah, I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but creativity is not a very good copying of something. Creativity is this spurt, right? Genius happens when there is such a departure from the norm that people at the time think you're insane, like Jackson Pollock, like Pablo Picasso, like Philip Glass. I mean, anything, right? So they think you're crazy, you know, but this creativity kind of thing. And maybe that's what the robot can't do, make that leap. The robot is going to look at Mondrian and all these other things, and then it's going to come up with some splatter thing that has never been seen. Like, why in the world would that happen? But maybe the robot would look at his dish rag, the rag after he's cleaned off all of his things, and goes, "That is neat," and then make something similar. Maybe.
Well, I guess it's that
is neat
the hard thing,
right?
Couldn't teach a robot to do. I watched. There's a fantastic. I love Smarter Every Day. You ever watch that guy? Destin with Smarter Every Day. I think he's a rocket propulsion scientist, but he does all kinds of fascinating things. And they were working. I was just watching this morning actually before it came out. They were working on how to put sensors in a circular saw so it shuts down when it kicks back.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff machines are phenomenal with, and it's all machine learning. They just put data sets and told the machine to figure out when it's going to kick back, and it did it all itself. Like, machine learning there's all kinds of things that are phenomenal that we haven't even tapped yet. But that is neat. I don't think is ever anything that sensors will do.
So I've read this really cool, I can't remember the book, and I wish I could because I want to reread it. It was so great. But it talked about a robot that listened to pop music. Okay, all different genres of music all through time.
I think I heard about this.
Found
the pattern.
Patterns and similarities of what becomes successful. So then record executives could feed it new music, and the robot could say, yes, this would be a hit, or no, this wouldn't be a hit, based on the kind of empirical data that it had gathered over hundreds of years of listening to music, right? And the what's that song, "Shake It Like a Polaroid"? Do you know that? You know what I'm talking about?
I'm a little bit out of pop culture.
Okay. Well, it was many years ago, and everybody's going to be screaming into the thing. Oh, you're an idiot. I'm an idiot. But anyway, this robot said that song. It was Outkast as the band, and that song is going to be a hit. It's a hit, right? And they played it on the radio, and nobody cared. Nobody cared, and they're like, "This doesn't make any sense. This is supposed to be a hit." So then the record exec said, "Okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to play a hit that people like right now, and then you're going to play the Outkast song. After every hit that they hear, you're going to play the Outkast song." And they had all these different things, and then eventually it became this runaway, insane hit.
But they had to make it. They had to prime people.
They did, and did the robot think ahead? Was the robot like, okay, this has all
were the people wrong, or were the robot
right?
Wrong?
Yeah, and eventually, it was a huge hit. It still is. It's it gets covered all the time. It's a really popular song.
Let's circle back to story, though.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is where you wanted to go, but there's some fascinating things to me about story, because story is essentially identity, right? Like, it's how you identify something. Either it's a cultural identification, or like what's compelling about a story is your ability to empathize with it. To
feel it.
When we hear a good story, it's like, oh, I could put myself in that place. And I think that personal story, family story, tribe story, nation story is really important stuff. Sadly, I think American Christians have lost their sense of story, and that's why the roots of what Christianity is supposed to be are so delinquent in American Christianity. They've lost their story. They've lost their place where they come from. They've lost their identity in that origin narrative of the gospel. And those kinds of, when you see, that's how a national story functions, right? Like, it's why we teach revolutionary history to our 6th graders, so that there's some kind of idea of, why does this country matter? Where did it come from? And what's at the root of our origin? And why are Americans American? What's the sense of all of us? What puts all of us in the same package? Like, how do we make a box that's around all of America? And that's why I think story has these common factors and these common parts that are ubiquitous. They're always going to be in there. And I think that's where Gillette's narrative is missing the mark, that we will recreate these stories because we will recreate society, and we will recreate religion. We will recreate a narrative around why God is, and that we would very much do the same thing that human history has done. What I sent you I don't think that science is going to eliminate that, because I think they're coming out of the heart of man. I think they're coming out of what we are.
Right, but what about Christianity?
Christianity in particular. So
And I'm just saying, when we recreate the stories,
would we recreate Christianity?
Would we recreate Jesus Christ as the Son of God, born from a virgin mother?
Well, here's what the analysis misses. Mm-hmm. Was God, the creator, a divine mover in that story? Did he make the story to happen? Did the story come from God, or did the story come from man? Well, if the story came from God, then he's going to recreate the story. He'll put that narrative back together.
So why did God give the story to the Europeans and not to the Asian culture?
He didn't give it to the Middle Easterners, but
right, okay, and not the Asian culture and the Indian culture and the Native American culture and the Egyptian. Why?
So this goes back to the Ricky Gervais, like a million gods minus one. And the problem with that analysis is, what I would say to Ricky, or to you, if you were to tell me you're just an atheist plus one, is I would say, well, how many answers are there to 2 plus 2?
Ricky Gervais said there's like 3,000 gods in the world.
I don't believe all of them.
And I don't believe in any of them. And
you just believe in one more.
You only believe in one. You don't believe in 2,999 gods, so therefore you're really only one removed from atheism.
The problem with the analysis is that there's only one answer to 2 plus 2. Like, there's an infinite minus one wrong answers to that question. And so the exclusivity of a truth proposition requires that there's one answer.
So the Indian religion, the Hindi, are not true?
I think
it's 2 plus 2 equals 5 over there?
Yeah. I mean, so I would say that because I'm a Christian. Now, he's going to say that about me as a...
Right, but why did God not just give the truth to everybody?
Well, I think what God gave to everybody was a desire to find God. And that all these different systems come out of that same impulse in man. And the thing that's in us that wants the answer to life, that wants to know the reason for what is, that wants to know, where do I come from and where am I going, and how does this miracle of identity and self exist in this miraculous world? That one of the things that bothers me the most about the scientific narrative is that it seems to lose, for all the talk about reveling in the stars and the cosmos, it's so reductionist that those people all seem depressed and sad to me. Like, it takes a Chesterton, someone who can marvel at the same thing over and over again. Chesterton is he's sometimes called the Prince of Paradox, and he has these beautiful illustrations of why Jesus picks a child and sets him on a lap and says the kingdom of God is like a child. And he says, because the child can find infinite joy in repetition. The same thing over and over. You know, you play with a child, it's almost like a dog throwing a stick. Yeah. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And that ability to revel in the common is this divine spark.
So you don't think that scientists study the planets and just go, man, that's awesome?
Yeah, they do, but I think when they say that that's awesome, that's the mystery part of them that's firing. It's the desire for mystery, the desire for unknown, the desire for mystique.
But I think figuring out the mystery is what's so fun.
Sure.
I mean, you know, when they finally figured out that molecules or atoms spinning around a nucleus, it's just like, wow, and that it applies to everything, and that they tested it and it actually does. I mean, that just must have been the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, figuring stuff out, certainly. That's what the curiosity is in us for.
But if you were born in India, you would be Hindu.
Well,
you, Matthew, would be Hindu.
Or Buddhist or Christian or Catholic. Or
I'm just not sure. Well, okay, whatever. You know, if you were born in Japan, you'd be, what is it, Buddhism?
Shinto or Buddhist. Or...
So I'm just saying, you're Christian because you were introduced to God in the Christian context as He's the Creator, whatever. If were you introduced as another religion, that would be your religion, and you would be devout because you're a devout person and you believe.
But why do people convert?
You know, they convert all over the place, back and forth. I mean,
Americans.
Why do? I mean, my cousin was a very religious person who converted to the Muslim faith. I mean, you know, that's. I don't know why people convert. I don't know why people believe in God.
Isn't that a contrapositive to your notion that you're a Muslim if you're from the Arabian Peninsula?
Right. I mean, I suppose I'm speaking of 99% of the people. Yes, there are people that will convert. I mean, and I was certainly born a Christian. I went to church and I was told God exists, and then I figured out that God doesn't exist. And I actually feel comfortable in that. I feel more comfort in knowing that it's just a bunch of spinning electrons. Then there's a guy that's not answering prayers, or that's causing awful things to happen, or allowing awful things to happen. I mean, I had just a super hard time reconciling, what's the point of prayer? Like, what is prayer? You're going to ask for something, or you're going to, as you say, it's not just like garnering favors, but what is the point of prayer if not to ask for some sort of influence? And if there is a God that does influence things, then he's cruel. And if he doesn't influence things, then what's the point?
It's called the problem of evil, and we should do a whole episode on the problem of evil. But I'd like to track down that, like, you're born a Hindu or you're born a Christian, because the problem with that analysis is it's entirely too shallow. Like, Hinduism came from somewhere. Christianity, there was no Christians in the 1st century A.D. So in 100 years, one idea about one man swept the Western world. Like, nobody was a Christian when Paul went to Corinth. And, like, the ideas around the origin story of Christianity, that this weird little Jewish man with no scripture, no church, no Western civilization was able to convince people that there was a Jewish guy, who everybody hated, the Jews, was the Son of God and rose from the dead, and it spreads like wildfire, is a contrapositive to the idea that you're just born into the religion.
Well,
that you
I'm
are.
not sure that it wasn't a cultural mishmash of the time that let that happen. I mean, Charles Manson's followers believed very much so that he was the savior.
Sure.
So he's just a crazy person.
But every religion comes
Jesus
from
isn't
nowhere.
a crazy person because there's millions of people rather than just scores.
Yep.
To me,
Billions.
I mean, yeah. So it's just. It's just hard for me. I mean, I do understand that there's a need for storytelling. The sun goes across the sky, and people go, "What's up with that? Why is that? What is that?" And so people say, "Oh, it's it's a hole poked in the sky by God, or it's scarab rolling a dung across the sky, or whatever it is." But then the scientists actually test that there's this nuclear ball of fire, and that there's a planet that revolves around this ball of fire. And they test it myriad different ways over centuries and centuries, and it turns out that is probably the truth, because it is just so, it's so, it happens so perfectly to what we expect.
But do you know that those ideas aren't in contradiction to each other? Like, the idea of looking for order and reason in the world is a religious idea, and that religious idea of wanting to make sense of the world, that includes wanting to know where things come from, is where we got scientific ideas.
But I feel like we have to change the story when the ideas become uncomfortable. In other words, God said God made Earth. Mm-hmm. And then he made man, and then he made the sun to light the earth, or whatever it was. Well, people got hanged and burned for the idea that the sun is in the center and that the earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. In fact, Galileo couldn't even say the sun is in the center and the earth goes around. He said the earth is in the center. But if we want to track the orbit of Mars, it's just easier to put the sun in the center. Otherwise, Mars does this across the sky and Venus does this. If just hypothetically, if we just put the sun in the center, everything goes in a circle around it. That's what I'm saying. He never said the Earth is the center of the universe. And that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, because that's what was believed, and people were actually killed for not believing that. Well, since then, Christianity has adopted the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, you believe that.
Yeah.
So the story changes as science sheds more light on it, which just makes me feel like the story is there for reasons that no longer exist, for me certainly. But as we become more scientifically astute, the reasons that religion was created in the first place become less and less vital.
Well, see, that's the part where that's the most objectionable
the
premise.
Religion being created.
Well, no, that the more we understand about the world in a what is kind of way, the less what it means matters. I think that the more that we understand what is, the more we need complicated, complex ideas around what things mean. And what's happening in the world is that we're losing sense of meaning. We're losing sense of relation. We're losing sense of what a table means.
Right.
We can diagnose the atoms of the table, but we don't know how to sit across it and share bread anymore. Like, we're losing our sense of meaning. And that sense of meaning doesn't come from microscopes and measurements.
Well, let's talk about the Earth as the center, as an example, because that was the belief.
Well, there's
The Earth was the center of the universe, and that God created it that way.
In a very specific culture, under a very specific religious paradigm. Like, you can't divorce, like, that's not really Christianity or the Bible's fault. That's the Vatican's fault and the power play between the Pope and Galileo. Like, all of that are necessary conditions for that to arise. The Bible is not a necessary condition to burn people that don't believe that the Earth is the center. That's a political situation between the Pope and his power grab on the world.
Yeah, but the Bible tells you things that are right and wrong.
Yeah,
you know,
and so there's the point, is that whether or not the Earth or the heliocentric or the geocentric model of the universe, that doesn't affect meaning. Like, we all live the same lives regardless of that. And there's ways to see that in the Bible both ways. But what does it mean to be a man? Like, what's the purpose of life and how are we supposed to relate to each other? Those things don't change no matter how much we know about the cosmos. And that's the real reason for the creation narrative. It's not so that we can diagnose what is, it's so that we can diagnose why does this matter.
Well, are you comfortable with the idea that were the world to be, I know it's crazy because it won't happen, but well, I'm not saying it won't happen actually. Let's say that humanity does destroy itself and is reborn. Are you comfortable with the idea that the ideas will be different? Or are you saying the ideas won't be different, that the names might be different?
Yeah, I'm saying the meanings will reemerge.
Okay, and so they know those meanings.
And if
are those
God
meanings
is
universal, like the Hindi and the Muslims that believe it's the same?
So because I believe that God himself was involved in the Christian narrative, that Jesus was the physical manifestation of God, I think that story, and you can call a story a myth, that doesn't offend me, but that would be reproduced because God would have the same intention with humanity.
So it just seems like you're at a disadvantage if you're born a Hindu. I mean, it just sucks for you.
Well, there's
right? I mean, what's the point of that? Why would God do that?
Mm-hmm.
Allow that to that half the earth has a completely different story, and they're right and they're wrong.
Well, what's at the core of the story is right in all of them. Like,
okay.
the desire.
So that's what we're getting.
The desire for God. I think that God picked. I think that there is a way. There's one truth, and I think that one truth. Personally, I think that one truth is Jesus, and. So if you say, how do cultures develop economic security? How do they develop physical security? How do cultures of people? There are many wrong answers for that. People try and mishmash, and there's feudalism, there's oligarchies, there's all kinds. Just look at the political models of human organization. And people do all kinds of things. Some with disastrous results, some with great results, some with better results, some with lesser results. And societies pick a way of finding what's true. They start from tribes and they go to this. In the same sense, there's an initial impulse that I want to know why all this is. I have an impulse towards understanding the divine. And we pick out these systems, like maybe there's a god of the tree, maybe there's a god of this. That in the big picture, God plants the seed of wanting to know what in the world is. And then he allows us, through free will, to work out how that works. And so these different systems arrive to better or less result. And they're supposed to be going in one direction, like to find the ultimate truth. Mm-hmm. But they don't all. They have, some of them have disastrous results. If you look at the Canaanitish tribes in 600 BC that are offering their children into brazen idols that are red hot as sacrifices, or the Mayans throwing cutting people's hearts out. Some of those are disastrous results.
Yeah, and
the origin, and the Crusades, the reason men are doing that is what comes from God, but where they end up, there's all kinds of different reasons. I think that it's a statement of divine love, and this is back to the problem of evil. The fact that God doesn't force that has to allow all kinds of different outcome.
Well, a child is born a Hindu
Mm-hmm.
and lives to be 10 years old and dies.
Mm-hmm.
Was never taught about Jesus, never heard of him, never. So what's his story? I mean, how does he go to heaven, to a heaven where he's introduced to Christ, and Christ tells him all that business about?
Well, there's a lot of things about that I don't know that are particular to that situation. Like, we don't believe that anyone except an adult can even become a Christian. So some kind of consciousness of self and sin and maturity is required.
Do you
Before
believe
that,
in heaven?
Oh yeah.
And it's through good works and a pure spirit that you get to heaven? Do you believe in hell?
I do believe in hell.
So who goes to heaven and who goes to hell?
Well, so what we would say is that there's a judgment. Like, everybody faces judgment, every living soul, because life is miraculous. Everyone deals with their Creator. So there's going to be some point, some epoch in time, when all men face their Creator. It's generally referred to as the judgment. And there's some specific things that are said about that. It's said that every man shall give an account for the deeds done in his body, whether they be good or evil. So there's certainly some kind of accountability for what you had access to and what you did with it, that God puts that into play. The reason that I'm reluctant to make declarative statements about what happens to 10-year-old Hindus is that I'm not God, and God's the necessary component for proper judgment.
So only God knows why he had allowed this creature to believe something that's not true and never learn the truth and then die. And
he can give an account to his Creator for why that is. I think that the fact that there are conversions, there's a passage in Romans chapter 3 that talks about the knowledge of conscience and creation, that we all are alive, and due to our life we're given this kind of universal conscience. And that's, I think, the first step to God's judgment, is that the things that we all know are good and wrong, that are ubiquitous to humanity, killing, murder, stealing,
right,
all these things, these kind of moral imperatives that are a part of being a person, but are not a part of the animal world. Like a jackal doesn't care about stealing from another jackal.
Right.
A bird doesn't care about eating the same species bird's egg. Those kinds of things don't exist. That kind of morality doesn't exist in the animal world, but it does for us. And that's step one. Where those steps go to...
And I'm not sure that that's true.
Well...
When we talk about elephants and chimpanzees and the order of things, there are social animals that have hierarchies and don't kill each other.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I mean, those
but
same chimps
your
go
story.
in roving bands and rip the arms off of their warring factions.
As
humans do that too.
Yeah.
But we say it's wrong.
Degree. Yeah. Okay.
No chimpanzees standing up on a pulpit and saying, you all need to repent of your warmongering ways.
Right.
So anyhow, I those are things that people
makes me want to be a chimp.
Because you want to rip somebody's arms off?
Yeah, because of the pulpit guy telling me I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah, so I'm okay, not okay. I think it's true that there has to be a certain amount of ambivalence in the judgment, because God has to sort those things out. I think that he's a necessary factor in all that. There's also a very clear biblical notion of greater and lesser reward and greater and lesser punishment, that these things are on a sliding scale, that there is variation, that God's not just it's not just a yes or no box that gets checked, but that there's variation in all these things.
Right.
That gets played out through Christian literature and art.
So can you go to heaven without believing in God?
Well, I don't think that you can be morally conscious and morally aware and end up in heaven without knowing Jesus.
You can't be morally... Are you saying you can't be morally aware and morally conscious and not accept Jesus? Like, there are no morally conscious and morally...
No.
People who...
No, I'm saying if you're an adult, if you have a full developed faculty, the only way to God is through Jesus. That he's a necessary factor.
So let me ask you this. Let's take an example. I don't know, me. So I'm a pretty good guy, right? I mean, I try to do good in the world. I don't hurt people when I can help it. I'm a loving, open, kind soul. I'm a pacifist, basically, and I don't believe in God. Is that like a check mark against? Like it? So judgment happens, and he goes, well, you know, you were really nice. I mean, you were pretty Christ-like actually in your life, but you didn't believe in God. So you're gonna burn for the rest of your life in a fiery pit of hell, and your skin's gonna be flayed from your body. I mean, is that? You know what I mean? I just feel like what's up with, can't I just be good for good's sake? I mean, to me, atheism is almost like, it's like, it's good without the crutch. You know, I don't need reward,
but it's
and
not,
I don't need.
It's not good in so many instances.
There's
a lot of horrible atheist people.
There's a lot of horrible Christians. I mean, Jesus, what do you mean? I'm talking about just person to person. I mean, you and I, we've talked about this a lot. We are very much alike in the way that we live our lives, in the way that we treat our children, in the way that we treat our wives, in the way that we treat strangers, in the way that we want to help people, in the way that we are against war. And, I mean, the similarities are so far outnumber the differences that it's sort of overwhelming. But yet people think, how can you even be friends when his whole life is God, and my whole life is that I do not believe in this thing that is your whole life.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting to am I gonna burn in hell?
I think that there's a certain kind of cause and effect that is a consequence of will, and I think that God has arrayed the world in a way to cause all of us to want to find him. And I think that many people say, I don't want that. I don't want the constraint. I don't want the rule. I don't want the obligation. If there's a God and he's the prime mover behind all of this, I don't want to be subject to him. Those are all hypotheticals. If you're in that case and you play that hypothetical that way and you say, if there's a God, I'm not going to be subject to him. At the judgment, what God says is, look, I gave you a world. I showed you myself in all these different ways, and you continually turned your back on me. You continually said, I don't want that. I don't want you. I don't want what you are. I don't want your rules. I don't want your obligations. And what happens in the judgment is God says, okay, you get your way. I tried to
go to hell.
And whatever that means.
Those are the two choices?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I have a real hard time with that because to me, Jerry Falwell should be in hell and I should be in heaven.
Well,
if there's I mean, I don't believe in heaven and hell, but I don't even believe in an afterlife. But the fact, I wonder how is it that you can love me knowing that I'm going to hell? Knowing that God is going to just reject me.
I don't understand all the imperatives of what that looks like. I know that there's surprisingly few details about it. There's surprisingly few details about hell, except for that it's bad. There's surprisingly few details about
you don't
heaven,
want to go there,
except for that it's good. The rest is imagery, and what I see is that I think there's something incredibly unique about Jesus making a way to correct humanity, and that's what I'm more interested. That's not true. I'm just as interested in what it means to live this life the way that God intends humans to be. This, like, the term for it is vocation. Like, what does it mean to be a man? Why are men? Why do we exist? What's our created, designed purpose? And that the Christian narrative is designed to teach us that, because that's where Jesus is, the Logos. He's teaching us how to be men. I think that you're a benefactor from all of that Logos theology by default. Like your ideas around truth and justice, about individual rights, about order and a sense of order in the world, that all those things are borrowed from a Christian ethos. Like you don't accept the prime premise, but there's a lot of derivative value in your life from his life. Right. And I think that the long-term eternal spiritual ramifications are like that because this is a grading system, because there's some kind of sliding scale in what God's doing in reward and punishment, I don't know how all that works out. But what I say is that this I know is true, and this is a path towards right, and this will produce good now and in the future. And so I'm trying to funnel people towards that sense of truth. I don't know what happens outside of that paradigm. I know I think it's bad. Yeah. I don't know how all that gets reconciled. When you look at the disparity, the Tibetan priest that lives in a monastery his whole life and lives as a beggar or whatever, or Gandhi or whoever else. Here's an interesting point. Have you ever read Gandhi's Autobiography? It's fascinating. It's called Experiments with Truth. And in the introduction to Experiments with Truth, I was fascinated to read this. He said, I recognize something within me that's broken. And his whole kind of like the summation of his life and the title of his autobiography, Experiments with Truth, was designed to figure out what was broken inside of him as a person and how to set it right. And there were some ugly things about Gandhi. He was an amazing man. I mean, the fact that he can free a quarter of the world's population and use nonviolent means to do it, it's all amazing to me. He's a stellar study in what a man can do. But at that echelon of devotion and dedication and discipline, you see a man saying, there's something broken inside of me. And that's really what the quest for understanding the divine is about. There's eternal implications to all of that. I believe that. But what this whole saga of being alive is about is, how do we find the answer to that? How do I reconcile that when I was a teenager, I enjoyed hurting people? That's brokenness. Right. That's something way, way out of whack. And it's not just then. It's still, I still struggle with like selfishness. I still struggle with anger. I still have this part of me that's out of square. If you throw away the ruler, though, then how do you put it back into square?
Well, I don't consider, because I'll also struggle with being a better person and loving more and not carrying hatred and being happy. And we feel the same way about life and that journey, I think. I think we solve situations in very similar manners. I don't think that not believing in God is throwing away the ruler. It's like I have my own ruler. I have my own measure of what is good and what is bad and what it's like. And it's basically, what it feels like. It's to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's because I don't like what it feels like when people humiliate me. I'm not going to humiliate people.
But you recognize the problem with that
thesis,
right?
I try to teach my children the same thing, that part of life is figuring out what is broken about you, and then the other part of life is trying to fix that. And that's what you spend life trying to do, is trying to fix that, right? I want to be a better man. I want to be the best person that I can possibly be. I want to influence people around in as positive a way as I can be. And that is my own inner self, not God, that's talking, that's telling me to do that.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. But the problem is, what happens when somebody doesn't feel the same as you?
Well, yeah, you have serial killers who who legitimately
not
feel
just
pleasure
serial killers.
in
I think
torturing
you have
people.
most of our countrymen. I think that, I don't know, 70% of my neighbors would murder me for $200,000 if they thought they could get away with it.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just pulling some numbers out of it.
I think that's probably is true, and I do think that's very, very sad. And I, there's a problem in the world, right? I mean, people are killing each other all the time, and they hate each other, and there's just anger and anger and anger.
But not just that, but it's always justifiable from an internal component. Like, everybody thinks they have a good reason for being that way.
Right, I had this sort of theory in high school that there is no evil, and there's no such thing. Nobody does anything for evil. The serial killer legitimately derives happiness from hurting people, and he doesn't feel that the person is hurt. He doesn't understand what that even means. So he's doing what he thinks is right. I mean, or he wouldn't do it. We all do what we think is right, or we wouldn't do it.
I don't know if that's
I don't
true,
think
though.
anybody does anything for the sake of pure evil. I'd kill you to get that $200,000 because I really want that $200,000 and I'm going to spend it, and I need it. Yeah, there's all kinds of rationalizations, and your life is worth less than that. That's my decision. But I'm not doing it just to twist my mustache and be evil, and just for the sake of doing bad. I want to spread anger and hatred everywhere I go. I've never met that man.
I have.
I've met people who are very angry and don't understand what they're doing and are mentally ill, but I've never met somebody who does evil for the sake of it.
I think that, at a certain point it's semantic.
Yeah, well, this philosophy always is. It's always going to boil down to how we define.
But I think the way to think of that is that when I come up to an action X, and whatever calculus I make, I say, I know that that's wrong, but I want the result. I know it's going to hurt you and reward me, whether that's I get to explode my anger on someone and feel whatever. That's the nexus of evil. When you step across that line of your conscience, that is evil. And I think that we all, that's why I think that that's a divine institution like that. And it's pretty useful in most cases, but there's some flexibility in where those lines get.
But what about the child who has been beaten and tortured and spit on his entire life and has nothing, and all he wants to do is survive? He's never known anything except for survival. It is impossible to expect that person to feel for another human being and to give up of himself so that someone else will be happy. I mean, like, what does that even look like?
Well, think of the whole spectrum of that consideration, though, and it is so. Here's my thesis: if that nexus of evil, that line of conscience, is something that's endemic to humans, like we're created with it, is the way I would say it. That's like that's our consciousness, our knowledge. What happens is, so that if I go through trauma, I'm beaten, whipped, abused, whatever, my whole life, that doesn't go away. I still have this conscience. I still step across this line where I know that I'm contributing to that evil. I'm still doing something that I know hurts other people because I've been hurt. I know that I'm hurting other people. And so while there's a lot of factors that are this is why I think the judgment is a very complex issue that only God gets to navigate. It's literally why he says that we don't get to judge. There's kind of like this, there are certain things that I can tell are right and wrong because I think the Bible makes it clear. But when it comes to this like eternal question of how is God going to deal with people, it has to be in his domain, because nobody can do that calculus but God. Because you have to be able to understand that infinite number of variables that create a life. And these kinds of considerations are a part of it. Like how much responsibility do you have? How much access did you have? How much were you cared for? How much were you abused? Like, where's your trauma? What does that do to your psyche? All those things are a part of the analysis.
But, I'm not a perfect person. I mean, I might even be a good person. I don't know. But let's say I'm a good person, okay? Let's say that I am a good person. God makes me.
Mm-hmm.
all right, and lets me loose on this world. And I am a good person. I do good everywhere I go. But he gives me free will, and for various experiences that I've had, I've come to the thought that he doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
That he doesn't exist. So that when he then judges me later, I've been a good person, I've done everything, but I didn't believe in him. He's going to punish me for that. And then it's almost like I hope he's having fun, like he's just like torturing his sheep. Just does he just delight in the struggle? Does he just enjoy? He gives us free will and then just hope is just going to see if we do the right thing, and if we don't, it's like
No, I don't think that's a.
I mean, that's one of the main reasons I don't believe in God, is that I just feel like, how can there be a creator, an influencer, or somebody who makes this, who grants free will and then punishes its use?
I think that the punishment narrative is more of a cause and effect. So God set up a world with gravity and physics, and if you step out in front of a bus, as a consequence of this world, you'll be smushed flat. Mm. And that's just a cause and effect. It's just a condition of reality. That if you step into the street, you're going to get smashed. Does God want you to be smashed? No. Did he set up a world in which that was a necessary condition? Yes. The language that's used around the judgment, and especially these eternal punishment concepts, there's a scripture that says that these things were made for the devil and his angels. So there's this kind of like, they're still created by God, but these supernatural forces, and that this place of punishment and wrath and destruction is made for them. And he's not, there's direct quote, there's a scripture that says, he is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come into repentance. And what that means is that God's desire, what he wants is, and what he's using his influence in the world, is to lead people to the place where they find the setting right of what was made wrong. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden in the fall. The choice to reject God's way. And he's trying to get people to a place. And I think that it's a necessary condition of life and reality, for whatever reasons it's out of my pay grade, that the consequence to your life gets summed up, and there's a destination that happens from what the accumulation of your life is.
Well, let me ask you this. So somebody steps in front of a bus. So God has made this world. And one of the cool things about it is the randomness, right? The fact that we have this physical world, mm-hmm. and that you can drive a bus and that you can get in a bus and go from point A to point B. But in order for that to happen,
some people get hit
by a bus, right? So let's say that your child steps in front of the bus, gets hit by the bus, doesn't die, but is on the verge, and then you pray to God, please spare my child's life. Mm-hmm. Okay? Does God just say, well, I made the world, mm-hmm. and the physical part of the world is that people get smashed by buses, so what are you going to do? Does he not step in? See, this is one of my big problems. So then what's the point of prayer? Is the point of prayer to say, help me to accept that my child might not live?
No.
So what is the point of prayer?
No, the point of prayer is the same reason that you and I have coffee together. The point of prayer is connection. The point of prayer is relationship.
So then why do people pray? Like so if your child got run over by a bus and was possibly going to die, big chance he's going to die, would you pray to God and say, please do not let him die? Because you think that God might actually influence you? And then if you don't pray, would God then not? I mean, that's cruel.
So I would appeal to God like I would appeal to a doctor. I would say to God, when my child is sick, I say the same things to God that I say to a doctor. Is there anything that you can do? Can you help me? It's the same thing I'd say to you as my friend. Like if my child was hit by a bus, I would call you and say, Felix,
right,
my child was hit, and you would, and that
comfort
would be
you.
Meaningful,
sure.
for comfort, for connection, right. To be in relation with each other.
But if God is all powerful, all knowing, all then He certainly could do something. This is the problem. I can put those veins back together. I can't.
Yeah.
The doctor can't. But if God can and doesn't, that's cruel. And if he can and does, so that's what prayer is. You know what I mean? It's like we're in this weird, what's the point of prayer if not to get results? And if you don't get results, then is that not cruel?
Well, is it cruel that you don't empty your bank account and pay for
maybe
5 children in a New Delhi ghetto?
Right. We've discussed that,
and
that's actually something that I struggle with. I think maybe it is cruel, and and that's why I'm not a perfect person. That's why I am. That's why I can do better as being a human.
Obviously, we can always do better. But what the point to the analysis is not to make us feel guilty. The point to the analysis is that there's a rational way and a reasonable way for me to think of my life as not a moral monster. And 2 facts be true, that there are millions of children dying in the world today, and I have any amount of money in my bank account. And the way that calculus happens is that there's these tiers of responsibility, there's this spheres of influence and connection, there's all these kind of like frameworks, matrices, and narratives about life and responsibility and what it means. Where we cross those things and choose. So like, okay, I leave here, I walk to my car, there's a guy asking for $5. When I choose to give him $5, that's $5 that's not going to my family. I navigate that nexus every time. And sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's yes. And sometimes I'm making the wrong decision, and sometimes I'm making the right decision. My appeal in regards to God is that he's doing the same thing. He just never makes the wrong decision. That sometimes he does intervene in miraculous ways.
But if he never makes the wrong decision, why pray? So, what is the point to prayer at all if the correct... I mean, if you ask a
I'm
doctor...
not friends with you so that you can do things for me.
Well, I understand, but if you ask a doctor, can I do something, and the doctor physically has reached the limit of his arts and can no longer do something and says there's nothing I can do, he will die, then that's what happens. You say you ask God what you would ask a doctor. If you ask God, can you do anything, what is God going to say? No, I'm not powerful enough? No. Of course he can do something.
There's a whole calculus that I don't understand.
Right. Well,
like,
but that's the thing.
Here's what.
He works in mysterious ways.
It's not just he works in mysterious ways. It's very reasonable. So if every time somebody prays to God and says, my child was hit by the bus, what's the net effect of that in the world? Like
There'd be no death.
Okay, well that's not a condition of reality. Right. Like there is death. So that's a non-real. Let's just imagine that everyone who appeals to God for a miracle gets a miracle. What happens in a world where everyone who appeals to God for a miracle gets a miracle?
Everyone would believe in God, first of all.
No, here, I'll tell you what will happen. The German soldier prays, God, kill my American enemies. The American soldier prays, God, kill my German enemies. Who gets the miracle? Okay, the bus driver prays, God, help me make sure and keep my job and get to work on time. The child who gets hit, the parents then pray. Like, it's all these intervening miracles. Right. Like, there's this chaos butterfly effect. Like I think that there's something important about the world and the way it is, and that when you step out into a street, there's an expectation that you'll be hit, so that you learn to look both ways. If you remove that consequence from reality, the world goes into chaos. Like, this natural order isn't something that can just be messed with without effect. And that's the analysis that God makes when he chooses to do a miracle and chooses not to, is that what does this impact have on the real world? Like, are people not going to wash their hands anymore because they can always just ask me for a miracle when they get sick? Like, all the implications, the downstream implications of messing with the physical world are something that just like the judgment is something that only God can deal with the calculus of.
So one reason that I don't believe in God is that I don't think he does mess with the physical world. Like, I don't think that God steps in sometimes and saves the child and then sometimes lets the child die. And, when I think of miracles that people say, and I mean, we both agree that these people are shucksters probably, but these people on TV, they're like, oh, okay, you can walk. They make the lame walk, and they remove cancer, but they don't ever grow a amputated limb back.
Well, they don't remove cancer either.
Well, yeah, but it's like, oh wow, I'm cured.
Mm-hmm.
We all know. I mean, studies have been shown that placebo works even if you are told it's a placebo.
Yeah, I know.
So, the miracle would be giving a amputee his leg back.
Mm-hmm.
That I've never seen
Yeah.
or heard of ever in the history of the world. I've never heard of somebody growing a leg back that works.
Well, the people, the blind receive sight, and the lame walk in the gospel. It's one of the evidences of the Messiah, but they're incredibly rare circumstances. They're miracles, and I think that the reason they're miracles is because that intervention in the physical world isn't without consequence.
But I just feel like if my child gets hit by the bus and I pray to God to save him and he doesn't, I'd just be like, okay, oh well. I guess I didn't deserve it, or maybe it was I sinned, or
what that demonstrates is a theology. What that demonstrates is that the reason people, I think that's a very primitive view of God. That's a very pagan view of God. Like, it's this appeasement for power, and I don't think that's the construct that God was trying to institute in religion. I think he was trying to institute a way of healing self, a way of fixing the world. And here's the other thing, that if God's going to feed all tonight he chooses to rain rice in the New Delhi ghetto, there's something that happens. Here's one of those downstream effects. All of a sudden we don't feel responsible for the orphans in the New Delhi ghetto. Like, that's God's job to rain rice on them. And I don't think that's the construct that God's trying to make out of the world. I think he's trying to fix us. He's trying to cause us to be the answer to these problems. He's stimulating us. And there's no doubt a real human cost to all those things.
So there's a little bit of, you need to do this without me in what you've said.
I would say we need to do this in collaboration.
Okay. So, but my question to you is, if your child got hit by a bus, would you ask God to intervene? Would you say, I want you to please grant me a miracle. I want you to intervene. I cannot live without this child. I need you to help me fix it. Or is it just, I need you to help me to understand either way what happens?
Well, I don't know what would happen if my child was in a fatal accident. I know that in crisis moments in my life thus far, what I've appealed to God for is connection and comfort and understanding.
Okay.
I have asked God for certain miracles. I have talked to him about health problems and things like this. But none of that is leveraged. Like, none of it's by way of expectation. What my expectation is that there's some way that we can walk through this together, and I think a real sense that we are.
What would be the downside of God proving that he exists? I mean, if somebody, I remember in physics class being told that the acceleration of all objects is the same. Mm-hmm. So gravity pulls all objects at the exact same rate, right? Yeah. And the science teacher dropped a frisbee and it dropped a feather, and you're like, well, see, but then when he puts the feather in the frisbee, and there's no wind resistance, they fall at the same rate. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so crazy. It's repeatable, it's demonstrable, and it made me go, oh wow, all objects fall at the same rate. I don't understand what would be, why there needs to be a question about God. To say, God, just prove to me right now that you exist. In any way, just give me something. Show me that you exist. Levitate the coffee cup for 5 seconds, and then you got me. Mm-hmm. That is it. What's the downside? Why wouldn't he do that? Why wouldn't he just have everybody believe?
Because I don't think he wants to, because I think that's manipulative. I think what he wants is for people to seek and find him. Like, how
But that sounds like a game. It's like, is that fun for him?
Well,
you know what I mean? That's what's so hard for me. Is it just, how can that not be cruel?
Is falling in love a game? Okay, so first, I think that he is proving his existence, although behind a veil. I get that there's alternative scenarios, but that there are good, reasonable ideas around the divine. Like, to look at the miraculous world and assume a miraculous origin is sensible. So existence itself is a evidence of God, albeit there are other explanations as well. So there are potential revelations of God if you have eyes to see them, if you want to see them. And I think that the reason he doesn't like leverage himself and force himself is that he doesn't want his relationship to be contingent on those kinds of things. So if I had to jump off of a bridge to prove to Erica that I loved her, she said, "I'm not going to believe you unless you jump off of a bridge." Well, that doesn't last very long. And then what happens next time there's a difficulty in our relationship, and she's like, "Well, I know you jumped off the bridge that one time, but you really need to jump off a bridge again if you're going to prove to me that you love me this time." And like, at a certain point you say, "Well, how much do I need to show you? And how much do I need to..."
Well, more than zero.
Well, I don't think it is zero.
Well, yeah, I know that's where we.
I mean, the fact that I exist, the fact that love exists, the fact that there's beauty, the fact all these things are evidences to me.
It just seems intentionally obfuscated a little to me. I mean, prove to me you love me is sort of what marriage is, right? Prove to me you love me is decide and tell me that you want to be with me for the rest of my life. I mean, that's how I prove to Sarah. Like, I don't jump off bridges. I'm there every single day, all the time. I will comfort her and receive comfort from her every day, always, forever. When she dies, I don't know what's going to happen to my world. Just the thought of it makes me crazy. So I can tell her that. But
that's the same kind of proof that God gives me.
Yeah, but he doesn't give it to me.
I
mean, honestly, in a way, there's a. I mean, I don't want to say jealousy, because I actually feel more comfortable with there being no God and my being good just because I am. That's cool to me. But there's a little bit of jealousy in thinking, "Oh, Jesus, take the wheel." It's like, wow, I've got backup. That's kind of cool, right? That you're not alone. That you got backup. That's kind of cool. I don't believe that. But I see the appeal for sure.
I think the greatest appeal for me is some kind of exterior standard, something to look at outside of my own emotions and rationale, and make determinations about complex things. Like this real cliched "what would Jesus do" kind of thing is a real principle of the Christian religion, that there's some kind of appeal to what someone to show the way.
Yeah, and I think
someone
that's great.
To be a teacher.
I love that question, what would Jesus do? Because the Jesus, as he's been taught as this pacifist, rebel, purveyor of ideas, is fantastic to me. But it works the same for me to say, what would Mr. Rogers do? It's the same thing. I get the same result. What would Gandhi do? I don't know any of these people very well, but the teachings of Mr. Rogers to me are pretty in line with Jesus. I mean, he was a religious man,
Christian.
Right? But he lived it. I mean, so Jerry Falwell is a Christian man too, supposedly. I mean, I don't know. A lot of people that I know that are really mean are Christian people.
Well, Christian is as Christian does.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, what would Jesus do is just sort of like, what would a good man do? What would a good person do?
I don't know it doesn't function that way for me. When I read the gospel narrative,
it's like, what should I do? It's better than like, what would Jesus do? What should I do? Because I know what I should do.
See, I don't.
And do you think that's what God is? The knowing? I know what I should do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the spark. That's conscience. Yeah. That's what comes from God. That's how we're made in His image. Yeah. But I'll say this, and we missed mythology and how to turn it.
No,
into
I mean,
law,
I knew that it would
devolve.
Go into this. I mean, this is what it is. I mean, it's religion is a story that you tell yourself. Why do you tell the story? That's what we're talking about.
I think what maybe the difference in the way that I would see, like especially the Jesus narrative from you, is that Jesus isn't sensible to me. I think that when I read the Jesus story, when I read the gospel narratives, it always catches me off guard. It runs counterintuitive to me. He does things in many cases the opposite that I would. So for instance, just one of many, 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 many examples. There's a time in Jesus' ministry when he's called the rich young ruler. A wealthy man comes up to Jesus and says, "What must I do to go to heaven? Have eternal life," I think he says. And like for those of us that have spent our life for the gospel, they'd be like, "Wow, this is so great. You came and asked me how to go to heaven. I got a whole plan to tell you how to do this." It's not what he does. He doesn't respond in any way like I would in that scenario. He says, "You have the law. Do that." Well, that's like, why doesn't he put himself in the middle of that? He doesn't. He says, "You have the law. You're a Jew. Moses gave you the commandments. Do those things." And he says, "I've done that since I was a kid." And Jesus says, "One thing you lack. Sell that you have and give to the poor, and come and follow me." And that's a really counterintuitive story to me. Like, I don't see that. Why doesn't he? There's another time when they come to him and they say, "Jesus, I want to follow you. I want to follow you." And he's like, "Okay. The foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. Do you want to follow me?" Like, none of that. His teaching is counterintuitive. Love your enemies is counterintuitive. Hey, none of that makes sense to me in myself. I would never recreate that if it wasn't for Jesus. I could create boundaries on retributive violence. I would say, don't hurt people unless they hurt you. But I would never come up with love your enemies. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that Jesus teaches that don't make sense.
I mean, there's people that I don't like. Very few people, but there's a few people that I don't like, that I don't talk to, that I don't want. And, when I ask myself, I need to just to lose this hate, right? I don't want to carry this around, so I should just love this person. But the thing is, this person causes pain to me and my family. Yeah. And to have this person in my life is painful and difficult. And to not have this person in my life has been fantastic. It's so great. Mm-hmm. So, you know what I mean? I mean, mm-hmm. it's difficult to love people that sometimes need to be hated. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, hate is but the word is,
not loved.
Banished out of my existence.
Yeah.
So we got a lot more to talk about, but this has been good. Yeah. And I love you, and we should live a long life so that we can hang out with each other as much as possible, because afterwards, right? Yeah. All right. I hope not. Love you.
Maybe God sent me to put you on the right track.
Yeah. Woohoo!